So today, I've been at Downing Street to meet Jeremy Hunt to talk about the announcement for the inflation figure, and it looks like there's going to be some good news on the horizon. But of course, there are some questions that I want to ask that I think will be pertinent to you guys around mortgage rates, what's going to happen to the property market, what do we need to do to make this sustainable? That segues very nicely into what I was going to ask you. And the question is, what will this mean for future interest rate rises, mortgages, and the UK property market?
Well, chancellors have a rule that we tend not to predict things because we know people like you will pick us up if we get the forecast wrong. But it's certainly the case that when inflation is down, the Bank of England can start to reduce interest rates. And today, an international body called the International Monetary Fund, which is based in Washington, DC, completely independent, predicted that interest rates will fall 0.75% this year and a further 1% next year. And that would mean that mortgage rates would fall. Someone on a variable rate would see their mortgage rate fall quite quickly, and someone on a fixed rate would see it fall when they renewed their fixed rate onto another fixed rate. They'd be able to do so at a lower rate. But the system we have in this country is that the Chancellor doesn't decide interest rates. He used to, back in the days of Ken Clarke, he used to decide what the interest rates were, but it's given to the Bank of England. And the reason for that is to give everyone confidence that interest rates aren't being lowered for political reasons. For example, ahead of a general election, but they're being lowered at the time that's right to make sure that inflation is under control.
Now, this is really, really interesting because bearing in mind, this happened yesterday. And at the time of the conversation, we didn't know that Rishi Sunak was going to call the general election today for the 4th of July. So I question, when I heard the announcement this afternoon, whether or not he knew at that juncture. I think this is being very strategic. I think they are going to try and ride the wave of this news that inflation is near the 2% target and use that as momentum into the general election. Now, I don't know if that's going to change the way people vote, but I do want to talk a little bit about the inflation number 2.3% because I've seen a lot of commentary today and people also mentioning in my Instagram feed that prices have gone up, and inflation and the way it's measured doesn't mean that prices are going to go down. So let's just talk about that. I've actually put it on a graph right here. Now, if this right here is inflation, right? This axis here is inflation, and this is time. And I believe this is an approximation of what the inflation curve has looked like over the past couple of years. But what people are basically saying is that, and you can see this in the news today, the commentary, the news that we received yesterday that inflation is now at 2.3% is them measuring this bit here, okay? So that bit right there. So the difference between these 2 points, that's what is the 2.3 number. Now, what people are pointing out is that if you take a look at the entire curve, so if you go from perhaps here all the way up to here, this curve is 20%. So what people are saying is, well, prices are up 20% over the last couple of years. And what you're now doing is you're celebrating the fact that we have inflation at 2.3% because you're not taking into consideration the full picture from here all the way up to here. And I think it's really important to understand what we're actually measuring when we come to talk about the inflation rate specifically. Now, if you look at it for what it is, over the past 2 years, yes, this number has increased. It is at 20%. This number is absolutely spot on. But as you probably remember, in October 2022, the inflation rate, the peak was 11.1%. And that peak will be accounted for in somewhere in this period right here, right? It would be accounted for within that period. So what they're looking at right now is the most recent read for inflation. So how much are prices rising by? That number is 3.2%. Now, it doesn't mean under any circumstances that prices are going to go down. Absolutely not. It simply means that prices aren't rising as quickly as they were before. And when you look at it from that point of view, it is a little bit encouraging because it means we're moving kind of more into the realm of normality and we're close to that 2% target.
And I think that is the right decision since the Bank of England became independent. Which was, I think, 1997. This is literally the only period of high inflation we've had. So for 25 years, that system has worked well.
Let's just touch on what he's referring to when he's talking about inflation being low for the past 25 years, because he is right. Right here is just a chart that has a look at the historic inflation rate here in the UK. Now, this reads up to 2022. And at this point in 2022, we saw inflation at 7.92%. It was up 5.4 in terms of the annual change. But prior to this point in 2022, the last peak that we can see here on the graph was back in 1990, inflation at 8.06%, up 2.3 that year. And then you've got to go all the way back to 1980, where inflation was 17.97%, up 4.54 that year. And prior to that, 1975, where inflation was at 24.21%, it was up 8.16. And I think this is indicative and kind of mirrors the Bank of England base rate, because check this out right here. So this is the Bank of England base rate as we know it right now. We are currently here at 5.25%. But if you have a look at when we were last at these levels, you've got to go all the way back to 2007. The bank rate was at 5.75, so we're still 0.5% off that peak right now. Now, the hope is that now that we're getting inflation back close to its 2% target, but what we will see is we'll see a bit of a reversal in the Bank of England base rate. But what I will say is I don't think, and if you look at it from here, in 2007, October, the base rate was 5.75. And you simply saw that when you fast forward to the June of 2008, the bank rate was reduced by 0.7%. Now, we went down quite a bit. I mean, in 2009, so almost, just a year on, the bank rate was down to 5.5%. We're not going to see those kind of rapid reductions to the base rate because you'll risk undoing all of the good work, right? What we do think is going to happen is we'll see rate cuts at 0.25%, and we may see 3 this year, depending on how they feel with the data once they look at it. But I think at least maybe 2 on the horizon for 2024. And I think that's going to be good news. Yeah. And what can we do to ensure that inflation remains stable in the long term?
I think we have to make sure that governments support the Bank of England when they do their important work with interest rates. We also have to get better at forecasting, because 1 or 2 things happened with inflation this time that caught people unawares. And so the Bank of England has done a big review of its forecasting capabilities to try and make itself more accurate at predicting when you're going to get an inflationary spurt.
Now, this is really, really interesting because forecasting is there is no exact science to it. There are too many variables that you can possibly get wrong. And I think if you followed me on the channel where we've done live streams where we looked at the forecast continually change. And that's because things change, the world changes, data changes, and data is driven off the things that happen in the world. And if you think about the last 2 years, we didn't know the war with Ukraine and Russia was going to kick off, which significantly impacted energy prices. And that's been one of the key drivers of the cost of living crisis, right? There are so many things that you can't account for. And so they can try and be as good as they possibly can and as accurate as they possibly can be, but are they ever going to be 100% accurate? I would argue probably not, because it's a pretty big job.
But I think the most important thing is that you have governments that are prepared to take unpopular decisions when it's necessary in order to get inflation down, because in the end, it is the most invidious tax of all, because it takes away your spending power, but you don't get anything in return. So when you pay taxes, you at least get things from it, like the NHS or your schools or whatever it is the taxes pay for. But with inflation, you get absolutely nothing. It just erodes your spending power, and that's why it is so destructive.
Look, we only had 2 questions each. There were 5 of us there. We spent about half an hour with Jeremy, and it was nice to kind of hear it from the horse's mouth. I think there's a lot of work that goes into the office of being the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Some things that I probably won't even ever understand. But it was definitely a privilege to be invited to 10 Downing Street to ask him these questions. And yeah, if I'm honest, it was a kind of pinch myself moment. I'd been to number 10 a couple of months ago to submit the petition for financial education being compulsory in primary schools with Go Henry. Like 2 months prior, I came out of hospital to go there. We didn't actually go inside. So this time we were inside, we were received. It was a beautiful moment, a definite pinch myself moment. Bearing in mind I've been homeless, this is pretty surreal. But I hope you enjoyed and at least got something from this video. I wanted to kind of expand a little bit on what we spoke about. Yeah, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you. Take care.